morning, everyone. Welcome to Coastal Hearing Room, the Cali, PA building. Sorry, mic is a little off here. So some housekeeping before we get started in this research seminar. You see right behind you is the exit signs. In case of emergency, please go out there and down the stairs out to the park. If you need to use a restroom, they're right around the corner here. Just follow the signs back to the behind us here. And otherwise, that's all I need to go over. Introduce our speaker, Melanie, here.
Good morning. The audio works, right? Good morning and welcome to today's seminar. My name is Melanie Zauscher. I'm a staff member of the research division here at the California Eye Resources Board. As the contract manager for the study, it gives me great pleasure to host this seminar. It'll be very interesting. Thank you all for joining us in person and online. For those of you online, if you have any questions, please submit them via the email address you should see on your screen, hopefully now or at least once the talk starts. And we encourage you to send in your questions sooner rather than later to make sure that we have time to get to those. Before we get started with the presentation, the reason you guys are here, I wanted to provide some context for the study. Get my clicker. So as some of you know, California has set a goal of having 1.5 million zero-emission vehicles by 2025 and 5 million by 2030 in order to help achieve the state's climate and air quality goals. To help accelerate the zero-emission vehicle market, the state nudged automakers to produce these through the Advanced Clean Cars regulation. Since 2011, California has also provided rebates to consumers of new plug-in electric vehicles through the Clean Vehicle Rebate Project. Starting in 2015, the state also began offering incentives for used plug-in electric vehicles in the 2 most polluted air districts through the Enhanced Fleet Modernization Program plus pilots. Currently, this program is being expanded into more air districts. The state has also set a goal of improving access to clean transportation to all Californians, regardless of their zip code or income. One way to do this is through the used car market, where the majority of vehicles are sold. Thus, understanding the development of the used plug-in electric vehicle market and identifying the factors that influence its growth are key to achieving our state's equity, climate, and equality goals. Today's seminar is broken into 2 halves. The first part, by Dr. Tal, covers the lessons learned from surveying owners of plug-in electric vehicles. The second half, by Dr. Rapson, covers insights gained from analyzing vehicle sales data. Specifically, the study examined the early used plug-in electric vehicle market between 2011 and 2015, including who purchased these vehicles and why, what factors affect the price of these vehicles, how they are utilized, and the role that purchase incentives played in buyers' decision, and also the flow of these vehicles between states. Due to time constraints, of course, not all the research findings will be presented. So I encourage you to look at the final report, which has been posted to our website, and the first 2 links on the slide. Some of the interesting results not included in the presentation are things like how the used electric vehicles are plugged and utilized or driven. This study is also an important component of a low-carbon transportation research, which supports our efforts to reduce transportation emissions to meet our state's air quality and climate goals. For more information and other projects related, you can visit the website again, the Low Carbon Transportation Research website, or feel free to reach out to me. Today's first presenter will be Dr. Gail Tal, the research director for the aptly named Plug-in Hybrid Electric Vehicle Research Center at the University of California, Davis. He is a leading expert on electric vehicle travel behavior, as well as understanding the role that incentives and infrastructure play in the electric vehicle market. He also researches the electrification of new mobility services and their impact on the electrical grid. Dr. Tal received his PhD in transportation technology and policy from UC Davis. The second presenter will be Dr. David Rapson, an associate professor of economics, also at UC Davis, where he co-directs the Davis Energy and Economics program. Sorry, there's no and in there, it's just Davis Energy Economics program. Specializing in energy and environmental economics, Professor Rapson's research includes evaluation of electricity pricing, energy efficiency programs, and vehicle choice and usage. Dr. Rapson attained his PhD in economics from Boston University. Before we get started, I just wanted to thank both of the researchers and their team for all the work they've put together for the study. I think it'll be very interesting, and hopefully it'll be very useful. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Galtal to get us started, and I look forward to everyone's questions.
Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, everyone, for coming and listening to us this morning. I will present some slides that I presented 3 or 4 times this week, and I hope that some of you, it will be first time, and you will be able to enjoy the fresh ones. But I think that it's important to put this used car market in the perspective of our larger goals. So I will start. Let's try in the back and see if I can read it and see the crowd at the same time. I will talk a little bit about the motivation, the study background, and then we will go to the survey and how the survey was done and what do we learn from the survey, and wrap it with the policy conclusions and how it's relevant for what we are doing. So we are investigating here the initial wave of the used PEV buyers. You know, we could have waited a little bit longer and get people who buy older cars with more miles. That will be nice. But by waiting, we will maybe miss important tweaks that we can do to policies, and we decided to do it very early. We would like to see how the price is determined, and not just the big picture, but also what people think about what they're buying and why. Awareness on incentives and how they're using the cars. So I think that this is a very important slide. I have this slide from a couple of different, actually I have it here. Let's use this one. I have it from a couple of different sources. The 2013 CHTS, California Household Travel Survey, the DMV data from 2016, and in this case, a set of surveys we did between 2010 and 2017. Ken Coroni was leading it. And this is any car ownership in California, not just electric cars, not just new car. Who buy cars in California? So the blue pyramid tell us that between 2010 and 2017, about 46%, almost half of the Californians' household were not buying any new cars. They were buying only used cars, if at all. About 37% in the 7 years of this surveys purchased one car. The timing is because we were trying to hit them with a very easy question. Have you purchased a new car between January 2010 and now, the time you were taking the survey? And the third group, at the top, 13.6% purchased one car, 2 cars, sorry, and 2.8% purchased more than 2 cars. We did the same analysis with the other data set, different time frame. You get very, very similar results. And the results are half of the new cars are being purchased by 15% of the households. Half of the new cars. If the guys who buy new cars, these guys, this 15% of the household like yellow cars, we will see a lot of yellow cars on the road. If they like electric cars, we will see a lot of electric cars on the road. And for our discussion today, they are buying 2, 3, 4, 5 cars in 7 years, but they only have 2 or 3 cars in their garage. They create a secondary market. The group at the top of the pyramid is the group that create a secondary market. So in order to get to the 5 million cars that we are looking at, we have to go through this group that buy many cars, and that will trickle down to the people with 0 new cars, but they will drive the used PEVs down the road. And in this study, we are looking at the guys down with the 0 new cars. Or sometimes they do have new cars, but at least 0 new plug-in cars. This thing is already happening today. We keep studying the new car market, the new PEV buyers, new plug-in electric vehicle buyers again and again. We started in 2011, actually, and the last survey we did was a couple of months ago in the end of 2017. On the last survey, 30% of the buyers were already on their second plug-in. Some of them have 2 plug-ins in the household. Many of them switch one for the other. So already in 2017, we see this tip of this pyramid happening when PEV buyers are buying their second car, some of them buying their third car, and some hold for the old one and some trickle them down to the secondary market. You can see that it started to happen in 2014 and 2015, and these are the cars that we are studying in the used car market today. Now, the main reason that it's happened so fast with plug-in hybrids is that half of the market is leased. And when half of the market is leased, we have a quick turnover of 2 or 3 years when people in 3 years return the car and get a second one. And we create a used car market much faster than the ICE market, or a market that have less leased car. You can see that Tesla, that is not doing a lot of lease, have very few cars in the secondary market. And that may change now when I see more and more of the Model 3s that are going to be leased, and Tesla is starting to look at it too. So we have to remember that the story of how to get to 5 million or 1.5 million cars is not about first-time buyers. We always like to think about it as we need to figure out who are these early adopters and sell one car to each one of them and move on to the next household and the next household and the next household till we get 1.5 or 5. That's not the story. The story is that's part of it. First-time new PEV buyers, that's only one group. The second group that we need to focus is these people who buy many cars again and again, and why they buy. The third one is the first-time buyers who have no longer have a PEV. They had one for a year, 2 or 3. They got rid of it. And now it's an open question, and I will be happy to study it. Are they more likely to buy a new PEV when the range is going up, or where they like burned and they will never buy it? The fourth one is the one we are studying, that we're talking about today, is the first-time used PEV buyers. People who are risk takers, early adopters, but they were taking risk by buying a used PEV. And the last one, it's already there, I don't have the data on it, is people who buy more than one used car and have a household used car. In any case, most of the transactions in the market happen at the used car market. So in order to sell 5 million new cars, we probably need more than 5 million transactions of cars in the used market over this next 12 years between now and 2030. So we conducted a survey in 2016, 2 years now. And the initial study design proposal was a really big one. We wanted to study the used PEV buyers by having a survey of the used ICE buyers and compare this group. We would like to compare them to the new PEV buyers, so why they go for a used and all. And we would like to see the difference between new and used ICEs and new and used PEVs. That was a kind of, I think, very ambitious goal. And for many different reasons, none of them is my choice, we end up with one study, just the used PEV buyers. So when you kind of think about good question to ask me later and think, how is that compared to used regular car buyers? My answer is already now, I don't know. So let's focus on what we do have in this study. We do have a good comparison to the new EVMT or new PEV buyers because we did a lot of surveys on them and we try to keep as many questions as we can comparable. So it's not easy to find these used buyers. They're not applying for a rebate. They are not showing up at the DMV, at the dealers' data sets. It's much harder to find them. But with the help of CARB staff and the DMV records, we identify about 14,000 used used cars on the DMV records. We had to send them a postcard home, one by one, and we sent 4,700 postcards with a link to a survey. And about 800 or 900 people even started the survey. Not everyone who started the survey actually had a used PEV because there are always some errors. But we had 602 usable surveys of people who owned or purchased a used PEV and use it for private use only. So if it was company, if it was anything else, it's out of the study. It's about private owners. The survey itself is about 40 minutes. So brave guys who went through the full survey, and it's a lot of very good information. So what do we have here? We have very, very early adopters. They purchased model years, mostly 2011, 12, 13, few 2014 cars. The survey was in 2016, so if you had a used 2014 car, you bought it almost new, second-hand, but almost new. And most of them were 2 or 3 years old. Half of the cars in our survey are Nissan Leaf and Chevy Volt, as we're expecting. 33% Leafs, 28% Volts, 15% plug-in Priuses, and then we have all the others, Tesla Model S's, few Fords, Energies, RAV4 EVs, i3, and so on. You have to remember that these cars were very new in 2016, so they were not popular on the secondary market. So what do we learn from the survey? You remember I told you that we had some missing parts in the survey design. And the question that everyone asked, and I had to have one slide that tried to answer, is are these guys who buy the used PEV very different from everyone else? So for sure I can tell you that they have lower income than the new PEV buyers. That's pretty easy because it's really hard to find a group with higher income than the new PEV buyers back in 2016, when the average income was $220 or $30,000 per household back in 2016. And our survey showed that the used buyers had an average household income of $160,000 more or less. So it's a much lower compared to those. Maybe we can say that it's also higher than the new ICE owners and used ICE owners. The problem is that the survey we have for these guys capped the income by $150. So if you have $150,000 or more, that's what we know about you. While on our survey, we ask people all the way to 500 plus, and that's the group that we don't know plus how much. My kind of gut feeling is that's the case. The used PEV buyers in 2016 had higher income than the average new car buyer in California. But it's apples and oranges, and we need to be a little bit careful when we draw this conclusion. When we look car by car, we see that the differences were in some cars, but not in others. The few used Teslas were purchased by poor guys with only $250,000 a year income, while the new were almost $350,000. But if we look at the most common cars in our survey, the Chevy Volt, we see that it's a little bit lower income, and it is statistically significant. We see a big difference in the used Leaf buyers. People who purchase a used Leaf had an average income of $150. People who purchased a new Leaf back then had about $220. And what I'm comparing here is not the original owner to the second owner, but people who purchased the same car at the same year that the used and new car was purchased. So it's not comparing the original owner of 2012 to the second owner in 2015. It's comparing 2015 buyers of Leafs. New 2015 buyers of Leaf and used 2015 year people purchased a used Leaf in 2015. That's what we compare here. And we see that there are some differences. We see no difference, for example, in the Toyota Prius plug-in. Same income for the people who bought them new and used in 2016. There are very few new ones in 2016. And I think we will go back to it again and again. I think that we see here the impact of the short a temporary restriction of the green sticker for HOV lanes in California. Back then, when we did a survey, it was hard to find them. And I think that people were willing to pay a lot for the sticker on a new or used car. Now, on my part of the survey, I was trying to see when these people went to buy a used car, what they were thinking, what was the process they went through, and why they decided this used car. So first thing, okay, there is a used electric car, there is a new electric car. What do I know about these two things? We asked them in a very careful way if they were aware of credits, incentives, and so on of a new car that they were available for them in 2016 or 15 when they purchased their in 2015 when they purchased their used car. And I don't know, I was surprised to find that about 40% had no idea that if they were purchasing a new car back then, they could have get up to $7,500 from the federal government the year after on the tax credit. So when they were looking at the MSRP of a new Nissan Leaf, that's the price they were seeing. They have no idea that the actual price is maybe $10,000 less if you add the federal tax credit and the CVRP. And that's about, let's see, for the Nissan Leaf, it's a little bit less than 30% that had no idea that the price they're seeing for a new car is much higher than the price that they will pay if they will go and buy a new car. It's not surprising that for the Priuses and Fusions, we have even higher number of people who had no idea that they can get this rebate. The rebate is lower. Maybe that's kind of correlated with the awareness. People talk about it less. I was surprised that the awareness did not improve dramatically between 2013 and 2014, but nothing between 2014 and 2015. The same level of awareness, the same amount of people who said, no, we had no idea that we could have get better deal on a new car. So some people, more than half, had knowledge about it, but about 40% had no knowledge about it. So is it because they didn't ask the right people? Let's see if people who purchased the car, let's say I purchased a used Nissan Leaf from a Nissan dealer, I thought maybe you will have a better chance to know about different incentives. These guys kind of are in the business of selling these cars. The general story is that there's no huge differences. Still, a lot of people who had no idea that had no awareness of the federal tax credit purchased the cars from a car dealership of the brand they were purchasing. Many others purchased it from other car dealership and private owners and so on. That's not surprising. It's kind of correlated very well with other studies we are doing at the PHNEV Research Center showing that the dealers are not a great source of information. So it's not surprising that for the used cars, they are not a great source of information. And we probably need to work on it some more. The second thing we asked, have you had any knowledge about your battery capacity? Now, going back to this fact that we did a study with very early adopters that had very low miles on their used cars, most of the cars were still under warranty. 97%, I think we have few cars, handful of cars that were already behind warranty. But some of them were kind of 10,000 miles from the end of warranty, some were 100,000 miles. But there were no way for people to know what the condition of their battery, and you see it in their answer. 41% said, I didn't care about it, the car is under warranty. 11 said, I didn't even ask. 27% asked a very credible source, the seller. And there are a few others that look for a little bit more information. Now, if you remember 2011, 12, 13 Nissan Leafs, it's probably an important question. how far you can go on the used car. But I think that even today in 2018, we don't have any good source of information for used car buyers that can help them understand what kind of question to ask, how to find information about it, how do you measure your battery capacity with the used car, and so on. So this is, I think, an important point here, that they have no knowledge on what to ask, and they have no one to actually ask about it.
Can the respondents answer yes to more than one on this list?
That's a good question. So the question was if the respondent could answer yes to more than one of these things. I believe, just from trying to tally it up, that no. They had to pick up one in this case, but I'm not sure. Let's go back to this one a little bit later. Now, if they are kind of, not knowing much about battery degradation, some of them have no much knowledge about incentives of new cars. Were they even looking for that? So we asked them two different questions, and that's kind of on a slider bar when they can say not at all to yes. One was, when you started searching for this car that you end up purchasing, were you more likely to buy a new car or a used car? What were you looking for? The other question we asked, were you searching for your new car, or started to search, were you more likely to buy conventional vehicles, internal combustion engine, or a plug-in vehicle? Now what we see on this figure is combining the two questions together. The red area at the right bottom side is where most people are. They started a search looking for a used plug-in vehicle. Before even having enough for a lot of knowledge, that's where they started with. We were looking for a used PEV. They have seen it with a neighbor, the new one. They've seen it, they read about it, they were looking for these cars. We see that we do have some people who were looking for a new PEV at the beginning and end up with used. You have to remember that everyone on this figure end up with a used PEV. You see very few that started looking for a conventional used cars and end up with plug-in used car. And there are only about 2 or 3 people that started a search with a new ICE and end up with a used PEV. This kind of an empty group here. So we are talking about people that were seeing these cars around them, knowing about it, and were locked on the idea that I want a plug-in, and probably I can get a cheap one because it's used. That was their initial thought. Now, how to use these cars? I don't have a lot of slides on how to use them. I think I have one. And this slide combined many different surveys that we did at the PHEV Center over the years. We have a survey from 2015 of new car buyers. We have a survey from 2016 of new car buyers, and then we have our survey that we are talking about today of the used PEV buyers. And at the bottom, we see the range of the cars, PHEV, 10-mile range, 20-mile range, and almost 40-mile range. It's not a secret, the 10s are the plug-in Priuses, the 20 are the Fusions and Ford C-Max, and the almost 40 is the first generation of the Volt. And what we see on the y-axis is how many people drive these plug-in hybrids as hybrids. They are not plugging in at all. We were trying to help them kind of give us the real answer, and we asked them, plugging in less than 3 times a month. Because I know some people plug in a Target because it's the best parking spot. But other than that, they're not doing it at all. So if it's less than 3 times a month, we count it as not plugging in at all. Now, what we see is that the used car buyers had higher level of driving these cars as hybrids. We were really hoping that they are buying plug-in cars to plug them in, but they had higher numbers. The highest one was third of the Toyota Prius drivers were driving it as hybrid and not as plug-in hybrid. There are many reasons for that. One of them is that the car had very short range, and it's very good on gas anyway. The other is, as I said before, Some people were looking for replacing, they lost their yellow sticker many years ago on the regular Prius, and they were looking for a Prius with an HOV sticker that will allow them to drive faster to work. And they were not motivated much by the plug-in aspect of the car, but they were motivated by other aspects of the car. But we do see that regardless of your motivation, if you drive a longer range car like a Chevy Volt, you are way more likely to keep plugging it in, new or used, and only 8% of the Volt drivers were driving it without charging it. We asked them if they have the ability to charge it at home or at work, and it's not correlated with this behavior. The people who are not plugging it in can plug it if they would like to. Sometimes they have, they have a limitation, like someone told us on an interview that he bought a big thing from Costco and the box is blocking the charger. And he will move it one day and he will go back to plug it in, but in the last months, the box was still there. They have reasons, but most of them have a charger if they need one, or at least a 120 volt plug if they need one. Saying all of that, 95% of the people who purchased used plug-in vehicle said that they will do it again. 77% will do the same car again. 9% will, after they learn, oh, actually there were some incentives that I missed, said, next time I will go for a new one. And that's nicely correlated with the people who missed the knowledge. Another 9% were going for a different car. And we always have this cross switch also in our other surveys. People who had BEVs move to PHEVs. People who had PHEVs figure out that they don't need the range. They have other cars in the household zone and move to BEVs. It's happened on both ends. And then we have only 3% that said hard no, and 2% that just don't know yet. So it's looked like people are happy with their cars, new or used in this case. Now, combining all of it together, I was trying to create this very busy figure that will explain what does that make in the actual marketplace later. And I think that this is an example. It's not a strong statistical model that Dave will give you much better modeling later, but I think it's a good framework to what we are looking at. So let's look only at the 2012 Nissan Leaf. We have 5 bars here. The first bar is based on our survey of new car buyers, and on average, people report that they pay $35,000 or almost $36,000 for their new Nissan Leaf when they purchase it. That's before all the incentives and the credits. That's how much they pay at the dealer. The MSRP is very similar, it's $36,000. We ask on our survey, that's the second bar. The third bar, we ask on our survey, what are all the incentives you receive? Your tax credit, your CVRP, sometimes you got a local credit, and we did one minus the other, so the actual average price of this car was $26,000. That was the actual average price of this car. When this 2012 Nissan Leaf was purchased used almost a year later, just in 2013, the average price people paid for it was $20,000. So the car lost, a couple of $1,000s a year after. When people were buying this car in 2014 or 2015, a 2012 Leaf in 2015, they paid on average $12,500. So this is one car, how much the original owner paid, how much the original owner paid after deducting the incentives, and how much the second owner paid in 2014 or 15. So we hear a lot from the OEM that we have a big problem with the residual value. What they are doing, they are taking the MSRP, and they said, hey, the guy paid $12,000 3 years later, the residual value is 33, 34%. That's very low. They are right. If If you lose 2/3 of the value of the car in 3 years, it's look very, very low. But why does that happen? Let's see the first owner. He said, okay, I paid 26. I sold it for 12. I received half of my money back after 3 years. I'm not feeling really bad about it. That's what usually happens to new cars. They lost a lot of the value in the first 2 or 3 years. So the original owner feels very well about selling it. What about the used car buyers? He's looking up there and he said, oh, I can buy a new car for $23,000 because it's 2015 and I can buy a 2015 Nissan Leaf for $23,000. And I'm paying $1,250, so I'm paying 55% of the price of a new car. So for a used car buyer with awareness on the incentive and so on, it's not such a great deal. It's not third of the price. And the reason is, first, there are a lot of incentives, and when you have a subsidy, it's split between the first owner and the second owner, for sure. Second, the price of these cars, of the new cars, drop over the years. And if the price of a 2015 Nissan Leaf was lower than the price of a 2012 Nissan Leaf, you as the second buyer, you don't care how much the original owner paid. You care about how much you can pay for a new similar car. It's very similar to what's happened to us with our phones. When iPhone 3 was coming out, iPhone 1 value was almost zero. No one wants to pay anything from iPhone 1 back then because the prices changed dramatically, the performance changed dramatically. Today, when iPhone, I don't know what's coming out, the X, 10, 11, you can still get good money for your old iPhone 6 because the differences between the cars drop and the new technology is not changing that much. Here we are on an iPhone 1 kind of analogy. This table showed them all together, the same story for all the different cars in our survey and what was the residual value. And you can see that the story is between the 33%, the red one, of an old Nissan Leaf comparing the MSRP to the price paid by the second owner, to almost 100% if you compare what the original owner of a Prius paid for this car versus the second owner. So if you were an original owner of a Prius in 2014, you could have flipped your car and get your entire cost back, probably the impact of incentives. And everything else, all the other numbers are there between the original, between third to 100% of the residual value. Using this to calculate what is the value of the HOV sticker, we kind of estimate it to be $700 back then. So with or without the sticker, the value of the car changed by $700. And that's including both BEVs and PHEVs, and I think that we can do a better job on that. So as I said, the California PEV buyers have significantly higher income than the average household. And the used PEV buyers, you have to remember, take much bigger risk than the original buyer. If I lease a Nissan Leaf for 3 years, I pay a couple of $100s every month. That's the risk that I take. If I buy and pay even just $12,000, I'm buying a new technology that no one else had for so many years and so many miles before, and I have to put the entire money on the hood and risk $12,000. So to buy a used PEV for a regular household today, even today in 2018, is a bigger risk for your financial health than leasing or buying a new one when you still have the full warranty and so on. We see a big knowledge gaps in the secondary market. We see it also in the new market, and Ken Coroni in our center showing us again and again that the new buyers have a lot of knowledge gaps, but the secondary market have even higher knowledge gap. Battery incentive, battery condition purchase incentives. And we see that owners of the very short-range PHEVs charging the vehicle less than what they could do. And this is kind of a study that we need to keep following. We are selling today new cars with longer range, PHEV with very short range, and we need to see how the behavior changed or not with the second owner, with the third owner over years, when the car moved from the original garage when they had a charger to a second garage, maybe they don't have a charger, and different motivations. And we cannot just assume that the behavior we have seen on the first year and the first owner is what's going to happen with PHEVs over time. Overall, I think that we see that people are very satisfied with their cars. And we see that we are still in a very early market. People were looking for a used PEV and buying a used PEV. It's not, let's go to the dealer and see what's on the lot and end up with a plug-in. We are not there yet. In order to sell 5 million cars, we need to be there. We need to be able to sell to this big chunk of the pyramid I start with, a lot of used cars. We have to do it because we need to sell new cars. And you cannot buy your second or third car if you cannot get a good value on returning your original one. And that's why when we look at the residual values, we need to look at the entire story and not just on MSRP minus how much the original, or the second owner paid. And I think that I will stop here, almost on time. So thank you very much, and I think that Dave will be next, and the question will be after. Thank you.
You didn't drink the other one.
Oh, yeah.
All right, are we on here? Great. Okay, thanks a lot, Gil. First, I just want to mention how important I think this type of relationship between ARB and academics is. This project was really the first kind of entry point for me into looking at EVs, and I now have 5 or 6 other projects outside of this contract that aren't funded by ARB, but that probably wouldn't have happened if this contract hadn't happened. So I think it's really important to give kind of a boost to these important research agendas, and that's one of the roles that I think ARB supports. And I also want to thank Melanie and Annalisa for ushering this along with such professionalism and patience, which I think all of us on this project have had. So, okay. That said, so on this project, we're basically taking a retrospective look at a couple different aspects of the used EV market. And there are 2 main questions that we are going to look at. We want to look at the trade of used EVs across states within the United States and ask the question, are we seeing barriers to EV adoption in the used market? So I think you guys know a lot about the evolution of the market. Obviously, at the beginning, we started studying the used market at its kind of earliest stages. We were just seeing, the first or even second wave of new EVs coming off leases. So we're still talking about a very small segment of the market. So the first question, do financial incentives for new PEV purchases influence the flow of PEVs between states? We examined this using a really neat data set from the largest used car auction house. So when you take your car to a dealer and sell it, they're not going to just kind of keep it on their lot and try to sell it there. They're probably going to take it to a Manheim auction house or some other similar auction house. And a bunch of other dealers are going to be coming and transacting. This creates a very efficient resorting of the fleet of used vehicles available to purchase from different locations and meeting the needs of heterogeneous consumers. So we basically got a great data set from Manheim that spans this early stage of the used EV market. And the second question, do low-income or minority ethnic groups face high barriers to purchasing EVs in California? We're in California implementing a lot of policies that are trying to promote this technology. A lot of these policies include transfers of money in the form of subsidies. We are concerned about the equity considerations there, and I think it's reasonable to ask, is this market functioning for this subset of the population that we may particularly care about? So that's the second question. Okay, so let's start with the Manheim data. They have 62 exchanges across North America. As I said, when you take a used car and you trade in a car at a dealer, they're probably going to turn around and offer this for sale at auction, and they're probably going to also be looking to buy cars at auction. This is how cars are resorted across the United States. This sample goes from 20, well, actually, we have a larger sample that extends before 2014, but the sample that we're mostly going to look at here is 2014 and 2015, mostly because there were almost no used car transactions on the Manheim markets before 2014. So we see 83,000 HEV, BEV, and PHEV transactions. And for each of these transactions, we see the date that it occurred, the origin, so what exchange this car was traded on, the destination zip code, and the price at which it was transacted. We also see some features of the car, the VIN and odometer. This is not a representative sample of cars in the marketplace. This is not the only used car exchange in the country, and some cars, like Tesla, for example, don't transact as much on these exchanges. So this table just shows we're seeing a lot of Nissan Leafs and Chevy Volts and Toyota Priuses, essentially. But we still think there's something to be learned in any case. Okay, so on some of these slides, there's lots of words to make these slides self-contained, which I'm told ARB likes. But if your eyes are glazing over, then let me just tell you what the hypothesis is here. So the idea is you walk into a Nissan dealership. And in California, unless you're part of the EFMP programs, which at this time were not active, but at the time that these transactions were occurring, you walk into a Nissan dealership, and a new Nissan Leaf is going to be subsidized significantly, both federally and by the state of California, but a one-year-old Leaf is not going to be. And so while these two products may very naturally be viewed by you as close substitutes in the sense that you might be choosing between them, one of them is going to be highly subsidized and the other one isn't. That's going to, at least our hypothesis is, that's going to diminish the value of a used electric car in California relative to a new one, relative to the way that new and used cars are going to be priced in states where there isn't that feature, where new cars aren't being subsidized. So, our hypothesis is this is going to create an economic force, an incentive that is going to lead used EVs to be traded to other states, and in particular other states where there aren't new EV incentives. So there's a challenge here. There's lots of unobserved things that might also be going on. California is not representative of other states, I think, for many reasons that people in this room identify with and maybe take pride in. And so we need to, be concerned about the possibility that our empirical analysis might be capturing, other factors. So we had the idea that, I should also say, this work, the entirety of this work that I'm describing, is joint with Eric Mueliger at UC Davis. So, all of your criticism can be directed at me, and all the credit can go to him. But I should mention that this is joint work. So we had the idea of using hybrids as a kind of comparison group for what would the pattern of trade in the used market look like in the absence of subsidies. Over this period, almost no states had hybrid vehicle subsidies. And so if what we're trying to understand here is an underlying distribution of preferences for these vehicles across different geographies, our assumption here is that hybrids are going to tell us something about the demand for this type of vehicle. So essentially, we're going to use hybrids as a control group, and we're going to look at what happens relative to hybrids in the BEV and PHEV market. Okay, so you can see in this table, there's a whole lot going on. Don't squint too hard. Basically, the idea here is that when we look at the net flow of, is it possible for me to, can people online see when I move the cursor? Yes. Okay, so if we look here, the 2,830 net HEVs flowing into states with new vehicle incentives. We take that as evidence of a preference in states that have new EV incentives for, clean traveling technology. And yet, when we look at the net flow of battery electric vehicles, we see that there's a net outflow of those in states where there's a new car incentive. In non-incentive states, we kind of see that pattern reversed. We see flows, net flows of HEVs into non-incentive states, but we see actually net flows of BEVs into those states instead of out of. So this is, not conclusive evidence that our hypothesis is, is true, but it does show evidence of things moving in the direction that we would expect. So the idea here is we're going to regress a couple different left-hand side variables, dependent variables on an indicator for whether there's a new EV incentive present in a state, and a bunch of controls that are going to try to eliminate some of these confounding factors that we might think are driving the patterns of trade. And those two left-hand side variables are going to be quantity and price, essentially. So the reason why we need to look at both of those is what we see in the data are equilibrium outcomes. So, for example, if we were to look at the effect of having a new EV incentive on price, well, let's say that that this force that we're hypothesizing is actually very strong. Then we would expect not to see that entirely moving the price, but moving both the price and the quantity. Because if a used Leaf in California is not as valuable in California, it's going to be shipped out of state, and that's going to happen until basically the value of shipping a car out of state is brought down to the transportation cost of doing so, right? It's costly to ship a car across state bounds. So after a certain price difference, there's not going to be any more economic incentive. So we look at price to see kind of what is the transportation cost in equilibrium, essentially, that we're going to say that the treatment effect of these incentives on price is going to be some measure of the cost of transporting vehicles out of state, and then quantity is going to give us a sense of, how much volume of trade is this inducing. So I'm not going to dive too deep into these tables. I'm going to keep things kind of at the highest level, but we basically see that new BEV incentives are associated with about a 4 to 5% increase in net exports from that state. And curiously, and so that's consistent with our hypothesis, right? We've got a new EV incentive in California. We're actually seeing more net exports to the tune, on average across the United States, of about 4 to 5%. And we would expect this effect to be also manifesting in the plug-in hybrid market, but for some reason we don't see that. And actually, I think one of the overarching questions that comes out of this project for me is, what's different between these used markets for PHEVs and BEVs? I don't think that we have all the answers to that question, but we're going to see some differences in these results. When we look at price as a dependent variable, if you look at just the PHEV and the BEV rows here, so these are going to be measures of the average difference in price across states, or just in general. So PHEVs are slightly more expensive, and BEVs are slightly less expensive. When we interact that with new incentives, we're looking at the effect of the presence of a new incentive on the price of that vehicle. For columns 1 through 3, there are no vehicle fixed effects. So there potentially composition is driving these results, in the sense that, in some states there might be different make, model year types of cars being transacted that just have different prices. In columns 4 and 5, we use fixed effects to basically look within vehicle make and model. So we're saying, okay, let's look at Nissan Leafs and the prices at which they're being transacted in states that have new incentives and don't have new incentives. And we can see that there are some differences there, but they're actually quite modest. So about $250 to $400 essentially, depending on whether you control for some vehicle characteristics. $250 to $400 is the equilibrium effect of the presence of new EV incentives on the equilibrium price of used BEVs. And notice that if that were larger, so we want to think of this number in relation to the cost of shipping this to a potentially higher value state. So this is telling us something about the transportation costs. We think it's, on average, for the marginal car, it's going to be somewhere between $250 to $400 to trade that car to ship that car to another state. If it were lower, then we would actually see a higher volume and a smaller delta on this price coefficient.
Do you consider you only look at the shipping cost as a way of whether it's better to hold it here or send it somewhere else? Did you also, I can argue that the holding cost of the vehicle can be also an important factor.
Yeah, okay, so
Can you repeat the question?
I can. So the question is, are holding costs also something that we consider? They're probably very important. I agree with you. When I say transportation costs, that's kind of a heuristic, right? This is not, we don't actually have any data on transportation costs, but this is the friction associated with this transaction. We think the largest cost associated with exporting a car is going to be the cost of shipping it. But of course, yeah, there's going to be a cost of holding a car, and that's going to be on both ends. I'd have to think about how that would, influence the way we interpret these coefficients. But absolutely, I think that's a reasonable observation. Okay, so just to highlight something that is a big question mark in my mind, we see that used plug-in hybrids are transacting at higher prices in states where there are new plug-in hybrid incentives. This is likely something to do with selection, but it certainly goes against the hypothesis that we're investigating here. So we were kind of surprised to see this. I really would expect if there's a new incentive available, but not a used incentive, that should depress the value of used PHEVs. It appears as though that's not the case. I think that must be something to do with the composition of the states that have new PHEV incentives and the types of PHEVs that are being traded, or some unobserved characteristics of buyers in those states. But I would say this should be flagged as a question to be potentially investigated more. Okay, so the conclusions from this part of the analysis, I think, are pretty simple to articulate. The theoretical prediction is that we would expect new incentives to depress the value of used substitutes, to close substitutes such as used cars, and we find that in the BEV market that actually there's some evidence for that, both in terms of the rate at which those used BEVs are exported from new BEV states, and via the price coefficient. We don't see the same pattern among PHEVs, so that's kind of a little bit of a mystery. And the relevance to California here, the relevance to any state policymaker is, if we care about the location of the emissions reductions associated with electric vehicle technology, and if the way that we design these subsidies across new and used transactions is affecting where those cars end up, then we should think about that in the planning phase of EV subsidy policy. So this is likely, well, it's going to be relevant to state-specific greenhouse gas emissions reductions more than it is the effect on temperatures, basically, in the world, because it doesn't matter where a ton of carbon is emitted for the temperature gradient with respect to greenhouse gases. But for the calculations under how much abatement is California actually achieving and retaining within state, this is the type of thing that's important. And of course, for local pollutants, we're really going to care about this feature. Okay, the second paper is asking the question, do low-income and minority ethnic populations face barriers to purchasing used PEVs in California? So here we're going to use two measures of barriers. We're going to look at price differences, and we're going to look at differences in the distance traveled between the purchaser and the dealer at which they buy their car. With the idea being here, if there is discrimination in this market, for example, that we would expect prices of minority populations or low-income populations to be higher than prices faced by, say, non-Hispanic whites or wealthy households. Same kind of intuition about the distance traveled. If people, don't have, in certain subpopulations, don't have EVs available within close proximity, they're going to have to travel farther. That might lead them not to purchase this technology. That might be something that we care about. Okay, so we're going to look at this question through the lens of data that we purchased from Experian, which is a sample of vehicle transactions from 2011 to 2015 in California. We've got, roughly 90,000 PEVs purchased over this period. We're going to exclude leases, mainly because we think that the way that the price variable is reported for leased cars might be different, and so we just don't want to deal with that. There's no a priori reason to eliminate leases from the distance regressions, except that we want to have these samples consistent across the two different dependent variables. So we're just going to eliminate leases here. I don't think that changes the overall conclusions. One of the nice things about the Experian data is they include sociodemographic information and dealer information. So we know where the dealer is, and we know some estimates of the sociodemographic characteristics of the buyers. And this is basically, they don't actually survey these buyers, but they're using kind of public data based on things that they know about these buyers to guess their ethnicity or their gender or their income. And this is used very frequently in marketing data, so I think on average it's pretty accurate. I used similar data in another project one time, and my co-author looked himself up in the data set and was, I think he said they got his income a little bit too high, but it was pretty accurate. Okay, so we have a sample of vehicle technologies and a sample of new and used cars. We have about 264,000 vehicles in the data set. Because we're eliminating leases, the market shares of different makes might not appear to be what you would expect. For example, we have, the Tesla Model S is over half of our sample here. That's because there weren't many Model S leases, so we're not excluding them from the data set. But you can see we've got, the cars that you would expect in general. The ICEs here are not a random subset of ICEs. These were cars that actually ARB chose as being kind of comparable cars. So cars that someone who's buying an electric vehicle might alternately buy if they chose to buy an internal combustion engine. Okay, so in this sample, non-Hispanic whites prefer HEVs and PEVs, while Hispanics prefer ICEs. I mean, there's a whole lot packed in here, but basically the lines are the average purchase price. The colors correspond to different vehicle types, and the bars correspond to the percent of total transactions. And then we have everything by ethnicity. So you can see that, for example, if you look at non-Hispanic whites for new, for the left graph, you can see that, roughly 40% of ICEs are purchased by non-Hispanic whites, 50% of HEVs, and 55 to 60% of PHEVs and BEVs, for example. And the price of BEVs is significantly higher than the price of the other vehicle technologies. That's true both in the new and the used market. When you look at purchases by income category, so again here the colors are representing the vehicle types, and across the x-axis we've got different income bins, and then we've got new and used. The observation that that I think ARB wanted to highlight here is that used vehicles, the fraction of used vehicles for kind of households making less than 100K is higher than it is for new for HEV and PHEV technology and BEV technology. So I think the idea here is that potentially the used market is going to be an avenue for expanding the access to this market into lower income subpopulations. Don't squint too hard at the graph and the summations. You'll fall asleep. But basically, what we're going to do here is we're going to regress for this price specification. We're going to regress price of the vehicle on a whole bunch of things. Now, there are certain things that we're going to be particularly interested in. One is going to be the let me see, so we want to basically see how do prices vary by vehicle type, how do prices vary by income and ethnicity, and how to independently, and how do prices vary by income interacted with vehicle type and ethnicity interacted with vehicle type. Okay, so this is going to give us the whole kind of on average. How are prices different across vehicle types, and how does that price interact with different socio-demographic characteristics? We're going to do what we can to control for other observables, so like vehicle age. In this case, in the price regression, we're going to control for the distance between the buyer and the dealer. So there's a lot going on here, and I don't want to dive too deep into the specifics, but I will say that were we to find evidence in this table of some type of barrier or discrimination to low income or minority ethnic populations, it would basically come in the form of positive coefficients in the in these rows of the vehicle types. So our buyers, our African American buyers paying more for PHEVs, for example. In this case, everything is going to be relative to the base effect. So we're excluding non-Hispanic whites from the set of dummy variables. That means that you should interpret everything in the African American, Asian, Hispanic, and other columns as being relative to the base effect. So in this case, how does the price change relative to non-Hispanic whites? And you can see here that African Americans are paying lower prices than non-Hispanic whites for plug-in hybrids. Asians are paying approximately the same, Hispanics approximately the same, and other ethnicities are paying significantly less. How should we interpret that is the question. There are two main potential explanations for changes in this price variable. One is kind of composition effects, what types of cars are being bought. So even within make, model, model year, there are different trim levels that we don't observe in our data. So those are some things that are going to actually affect the price and that may differ across different ethnicities. So that might be one explanation. But if what we're looking for here is African Americans or Hispanics paying more for PHEVs or paying more for BEVs, we don't see that. If anything, they're paying less. And on the income, there's basically not a whole lot of action here. It looks like as income increases, other ethnicities are paying a little bit more for PHEVs, but there's really not a whole lot of action going on income. And certainly, nothing that jumps out in that is a pattern that would be consistent with, lower high income people of different ethnicities being exposed differentially to, say, discrimination.
Is financing going to be a factor in differential? Financing irrelevant?
Yeah, I would put that in.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, thank you, Melanie. The question is, could financing be a factor in this difference? And yes, anything that is unobserved that is potentially differing across these groups that we can't control for is something that could be driving this. So financing could be one thing. Yeah. But again, I just want to emphasize, there's nothing jumping off the page that says Hispanics and African Americans are paying more in the sense that we might hypothesize that there's some systematic barrier that's being imposed to their access in this market. Yes?
The Experian data set, does that include cash transactions at dealers or does it include owner to buyer transactions of any sort?
Yeah, the question is, does the Experian data include cash transactions or does it include owner to buyer, like direct, person-to-person transactions? The Experian data are sourced from DMV. So you should think of these as basically DMV data registration records that are augmented by ethnicity sociodemographic variables. So yes, the answer is it should include the universe of those types of transactions.
Can you talk about the first study? I have a question on the first study.
You can save your questions for later.
Okay, very good. Sorry, I didn't know there was more.
Oh yeah, there's more. We're almost done though, so yeah, I hope I'm not going too long. I don't think I am. Okay, so we did the same analysis for used cars, and again, the general my general read on this is that there's nothing systematic going on. There are potentially some patterns that are interesting here, which I outlined. So increases in income are associated with lower prices for non-whites buying PHEVs and for Hispanics buying BEVs. So, I think basically what's going on here is there's potentially different preferences across income and ethnic groups for different types of trims within vehicle type. But again, nothing's jumping off the page that's systematically saying, income or ethnicity are driving differences in prices. Essentially the same, I would say the same conclusion is what we reach for the distance regression. So here on the left-hand side, we've got distance between it's actually between the zip centroids of the buyer's zip code and the dealer's zip code, with the idea again being that potentially if there are barriers to access here, it would come in the form of people having to travel farther to buy EV technology than they do other technology. Now, again, this is, I might not have actually mentioned this. The kind of thought experiment we have here is, everything we're looking at here is relative to the patterns in the ICE market. So we have, the question is not, is there discrimination in the car market in general? That we are not looking at here. We would need a completely different design to look at this. But the question is there differential barriers within the BEV and PHEV subpopulations of vehicles relative to, say, HEVs or actually in this case it's all relative to ICEs. And again, the answer is roughly no. So looking at this, the distance regression results for new car purchases, the upper left number here just says that on average people travel about 8.7 miles to buy an ICE. They travel an additional 1.7 miles to buy an HEV, and an additional 4.6 miles to get a PHEV, or 7.5 miles to get a BEV. So people are driving greater distances to access these kind of more niche technologies. I relate to that. When I bought my Toyota Mirai, I went all the way to Roseville, which is way farther than I ever would have traveled to get any other car. But they were the only guys who had it. So. All right, and then we can see that on average, African Americans travel 3 miles farther to get their ICEs. Asians travel 3.4 relative to whites. So basically, whites travel the least distance. Non-Hispanic whites travel the least distance to get their ICEs. And then, we can basically see all of the gradients of distance as a function of the vehicle types and the vehicle types interacted with income. So, yeah. I don't think there's much more to say there. There are some small differences that we observe. I don't think that they add up to a story that is compelling, that there are any systematic barriers. And the same is true for the used cars. People travel farther to get their used cars, 10 miles instead of 8. It looks like Hispanic and other populations are traveling less far than non-Hispanic whites in the used market relative to the new. PHEVs and BEV buyers are traveling farther than people who are buying used ICEs. Again, to the extent that there are differences across ethnicities in the distance traveled, they don't seem to be in directions that would be, consistent with systematic discrimination. So Asians and Hispanics travel farther for the used PHEVs, but Hispanics and other ethnicities travel less for the used BEVs. So, there are correlations in the data, but nothing systematic. So it doesn't look like there's systematic barriers to adoption among low-income and minority ethnic populations. In the new PEV market, there's little evidence of minority and ethnic groups paying higher prices or traveling longer distances. In the used market, the results are mixed. My assessment is that overall, it doesn't look like there's a consistent story. If you really wanted to answer this question with kind of a little bit more certainty, you'd have to be able to control for the actual trims of the cars and some of the unobservables and financing considerations that are kind of lurking in the background here. But if those things are present, they're not large enough to overwhelm what I think is, a pattern in the data that just doesn't really show a story of discrimination. Okay, so just in terms of the policy conclusions, I think that the first study again has some mixed results in the sense that we show that there are effects of the presence of new BEV incentives on the value and pattern of trade in used BEVs. That operate in the kind of direction that we hypothesized. For PHEVs, we find that it's in the opposite direction, and I think that's, again, a little bit of a mystery. I do think that this is something that the state of California should be considering, even though the effects that we find in this retrospective study are very small in the sense that the number of the net flows that are being induced by this mechanism, even if present, are very small. But that's going to potentially change as the size of the used EV market grows, and according to the different distribution of EV incentives that are available here and in other states. So I think it's worth considering kind of the suite of policies that are creating these incentives and how to optimize them to achieve the goals that California has, namely lowering local pollutants and getting greenhouse gas emissions either in general in the country or greenhouse gas emission reductions that are located here in California. To the extent that that we're concerned about barriers to access to this market among low-income and minority ethnic populations, I think that there is not evidence consistent with that type of systematic barrier in the study from the Experian data. There are compositional effects that obviously, that I mentioned before, we can't control for in this data set. And we only observe transactions that actually happen. So to the extent that barriers are manifesting in non-transaction of these vehicles, then we're not going to be able to see that. So thank you very much.
All right, it's time for questions. I'm going to go around the audience, but I also want to encourage folks online, if you have any questions, to submit them. Maybe both of you can stand. I will give you this one.
Hi, I have two questions for David. One is whether or not the model is sensitive enough to pick up the higher cost of credit for low-income consumers of used vehicles for the vehicles they're buying. And the second question is whether or not, I was kind of surprised by the higher used vehicle price for BEVs versus PEVs in recognition of the fact that they're getting higher incentives that should bring their costs down closer to parity. So if you could address those two.
Yeah, so starting with the last question, I think this is largely a compositional effect in the sense that I think there are probably a lot of Teslas in that sample, but also the price that's recorded in the Experian data is the DMV kind of reported price, so that's going to be before subsidies. So I think you wouldn't expect this to be net of the subsidies that the consumer got. For the first question, is the model sensitive enough to be able to pick up differences in financing? I mean, I think that was already asked. No, so we're observing price to the extent that there are other non-price features that are varying systematically across income and ethnic subpopulations that we're not observing. Those could be influencing these results. I guess, though, you'd have to tell a kind of particular story to say that, okay, well, they're being discriminated against some subpopulations being discriminated against based on the financing arrangements, but they're actually getting a much lower price. That would be a kind of weird equilibrium outcome. So I'm not sure that would even, maybe flip the conclusions, but it certainly is something that we can't measure directly.
My questions are also for David. On the first study, did it factor in the requirement that if a buyer of a new vehicle gets a CVRP rebate, that they have to own the vehicle? Well, at one point it was 36 months, and then it changed to 30 months, so that would constrain movement across borders. Did it take into account that requirement?
What do you mean by take account? In what way would you want it to take account of that requirement?
Well, I guess my point is that if an owner is required to keep the vehicle in the state, for 30 months, even if they pay it off and are, they're free to sell it, it still needs to remain in the state for 30 months. And so it wouldn't move across state borders. Am I
Yeah, so if there weren't, so maybe, I think what you're saying is if there weren't such a requirement, then you could game the system basically by buying an EV here, availing yourself of the CVRP, shipping it out of state where it's got a higher value, and we would then see larger effects than what we see here. I think that's true, yeah.
Yeah, and then the other thing is that you really wouldn't see the effects of movement across the state until after that 30-month period with the way it is now.
Yeah, so the kind of arrival rate of used cars to these auction houses is going to be constrained by the rules of the new car incentives. Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, and so to the extent that those rules were changed, those rules were that the holding period was shortened, then we would see, I think, larger effects than what we do see.
Let's see. Oh, that's it for now. Anybody else?
This is also for David. So that PHEV effect is a bit of a mystery, and I was just
which PHEV?
Oh, effect? The interaction in the first study, the interaction between PHEV and policy. And I was just hoping you could help us think through to what extent that should shake our confidence at all about the BEV effect. So there's some uncontrolled something. Is that also going on in BEV? Can we make any assumption about what direction it might be going? If you could help us think that through a little.
Yeah, so that's a really good question because I think it should call into question, you should be scrutinizing the design based on the fact that there's this kind of weird result that we can't explain. But I don't, for policy purposes, I don't think that it should change the at least attention that's paid to this very clear incentive that's being created by the asymmetric treatment of new cars and used cars under subsidy programs in California. It's very clear to me, just put yourself in the shoes of a potential Leaf buyer who is entering a dealership that allows you a $7,500 subsidy for a new Leaf, but no subsidy for a 2017 Leaf. What's that going to do to your willingness to buy a 2017 Leaf? Well, it's going to decrease it substantially. That should also be true for a Chevy Volt, and so there's some probably compositional explanation for what we see in the PHEV results. But insofar as you care about the allocation of these EVs across space and the abatement that's coming from them across space, I really think that this is an important incentive. It's going to change the pattern of trade. There's something weird going on with those PHEV results, but I maybe wouldn't term it. You should believe one and not the other. But I think the theoretical prediction is very clear, and I think the mystery here is not the BEV result. The mystery is the PHEV result, at least to me.
So this is for either speaker, and I'm wondering if you were the state of California and you wanted people to consider purchasing electric vehicles beyond monetary incentives, are there any ideas you have about ways that might get people to consider purchasing an electric vehicle, like an event, a public service announcement, or have you ever thought about any ways that the state could incentivize purchases without, other than monetary?
I think that the main issue that we see with the used market and with the new market is awareness. So people know that these cars are out there, but they don't know enough in order to make the decision that they will go and study if this car is right for them. They're not doing this extra step of going and checking what are the price. Oh, there is a $7,500 here and the CVRP there and so on. They need to do this extra step, and we need to work on awareness, and that's the number one barrier. The second thing is that we would like to get more and more of these incentives that are not directly price reduction for the first owner. For example, I can think about home charging. Helping the second owner to install home charging is much more important, much harder for him than the first owner. The OEM is not helping you, you are not getting all the information. We can work much more about installing infrastructure and chargers for the secondary market. Altogether, I think that in both our studies, we are not looking at the supply side much. And with the secondary, with the new car market, we always assume that it's all there. Everyone can buy any car they want. But with the secondary market, it will be very important to keep look at where these cars go to and where the location, who buy them, how they're using them in the secondary market. All of our assumptions about infrastructure right now, about energy consumption and so on, have to be based on where this car is going to be in 10 years from now with the first, second, and third, and fourth owner. And we know very little about that right now.
Yeah, I want to just build off what Gil said, and I completely agree with him, in particular about the awareness question. But as an economist, I have to also say that people really do respond to incentives. I guess only if they know that they're there. But I'm doing some work right now analyzing the EFMP program, which provides some really nice quasi-experimental variation in the availability of subsidies to low and middle income households. And we're finding very high elasticities, which essentially means that these subsidies are effective at increasing the rate of purchases among the target populations. So I think incentives are really, if you want to increase adoption of this technology, I do think subsidies are the best way to go. I do want to stick a pin, though, in the question, do we want to just be focusing on this technology? To what extent do we want to, say, be choosing EVs over hydrogen cars? So, for example, I would love to have a hydrogen station in Davis, if anyone. But even beyond that, the benchmark that we use as economists is what if we were pricing the externalities appropriately? Which, if we were doing that in California, it would make ICEs more expensive and gasoline more expensive, and even electricity. Well, electricity is already too expensive, but it would make it, if you just added a carbon tax onto electricity, it would make that more expensive. What would happen if people had their incentives aligned with the social good? And I just want to float that as something we should be keeping in mind. It's not necessarily just about maximizing the adoption of this one particular technology, which I think can, close off avenues to efficient carbon abatement through sources that we may not have been able to identify yet. There was one other, I did want to also, Gil mentioned supply side incentives, and I'm working on a project right now that is attempting to quantify the impact of the ZEV mandate credits on OEM decisions of how much to, manufacture EVs under those, or other, even fuel-efficient ICEs under that program. That project is very early. It's probably several months away from having any results, but I do think that's a really important question. What are the incentives for the OEMs, and how effective is the ZEV mandate right now at influencing their behavior?
So I know this was on one of the slides, but the question didn't occur to me until after. In the first study, what was the total number of new PEV and used PEV sales? So is that about 10,000?
Yeah, these weren't new and used, though. These are all used.
Okay.
These are all, so the only vehicle that makes it to a Manheim exchange is a used vehicle.
And are there any situations where one vehicle might be sold multiple times and showing up? Like if it's sold to a wholesaler who then resells it?
We see that, and we see some really interesting patterns in the price, the transaction prices of those multiple cars, multiple purchase cars. Yeah, we're thinking of maybe documenting some of that. Yeah, there's some weird stuff that goes on there.
So I mean, I look at this and there's about a little over 10,000 total used transactions, and you said I think the net outflow of EVs was 745.
From
So
California.
it's 6-7% are sort of leaking out of state. I think that one of the things that obviously can't be captured with the data that you've got is the effect of sort of early adopters really pulling and having a strong demand in non-ZEV mandate states, and so that could be one of the effects that's pulling EVs out. So,
Well, actually, we do try to control for that by using HEVs by using hybrids as a control group. So to the extent that there's differential preferences between EVs and HEVs during this time period, then we're not going to capture that. But to the extent that you think that early adoption of preferences for early adoption of PEVs is correlated with high penetration of HEVs, then actually I think we're doing a good job of controlling for that. But it is an assumption that's non-verifiable.
I think, and I have nothing more than supposition to base this on, that for the early adopters, they understand the difference between a hybrid and a plug-in.
But that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, do we see early adopter preferences in areas where there's high HEV adoption? So if in Palo Alto there's lots of HEVs and lots of people who want to buy EVs, then we're actually capturing that correlation quite well by using HEVs as a control group. It's not about relative awareness.
I think that the missing part will be if new cars were not sold in these states. And then maybe your early adopters will settle for a used one just because they had no other option. And that may draw a few cars out there. But yeah, we have no information. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. I guess this is a hypothetical question.
The best
if
ones.
if you want to subsidize both new and used, what should be the level of subsidy? Should we subsidize used one more or new one less? Or which one? If you know what is the social, I guess one of the issue now is that to provide more of the subsidy to the disadvantaged community from the social equity point of view. But what is the optimal solution in the sense of that,
Well, you give me a social planner's objective function, and then I can maybe give you an optimal, subsidy portfolio that would help to achieve that. But it really depends on the objective function. So, for example, I would say that the best subsidy level for for any of these technologies would be zero, and we should instead price carbon at the marginal social cost of carbon. And then everything would trickle through. ICEs would get more expensive. The fuel for electric vehicles, which is partly generated through the combustion of fossil fuels, would get more expensive, and all of those incentives would be transmitted in a way that are aligning incentives perfectly with the public good. So, I think the idea that that subsidies are the only tool available to us is kind of not correct. And there's lots of evidence that people do respond to prices when they change. And so, I would definitely advocate for a social cost of carbon that is, equal to the social cost of carbon.
And I think that it's very important to remember that we need to sell, let's say, 1.5 million car or 5 million car, or whatever, to the first buyer first, if we want the second owner to buy them. So there is no way around making 5 million new transactions in order to get to 5 million in 2030. And if we need to subsidize that one way or another, we will have to work on it. I'm a little bit worried right now that we are discriminating against this top of the pyramid on my figure, because these guys need to buy more cars in order for the entire pyramid to have the cars. So without giving you any answer on how much and who, we have to remember that the way the market works is the trickle-down effect, and we have to keep it flowing.
But since you brought that issue, is that the only group can we provide subsidy to say that rental car agency, which sell, they
Yeah.
provide the used vehicle to others?
Maybe that's another way. You give it to the rental car, that create a lot of used cars within a year or two. They're not holding them for a long time. But we have to remember that we have to have 5 million new transactions in order to have 5 million sales on the road. Just going for the secondary market or disadvantaged communities is probably not going to create this original sales.
Any more questions?
I have a college kid at the house, and she's researching to buy a hybrid. She was asking me, after 60,000 miles, does the battery need to be replaced? And I have no clue.
No, the answer is very simple, no.
Oh.
The battery will be great, yeah.
All right, I got one more. So for Gil, so there was news to me, this fact that a good chunk of electric vehicle owners, especially the ones that have very short range, are actually not charging their cars. And so I was hoping you could just help us think through it all, or speculate even. So what's going on? What's going on in their mind there? Is it just too much of a hassle to drag this cable out every 10 miles that you drive or something? I don't know,
Yeah.
do you have anything to add?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And there are many things that are going on. But I think that the very basic story is, if you buy a plug-in hybrid with very good gas mileage, because it's a hybrid in this case, every time you plug in the car, you save. You save a nickel, you save a dime. That's more or less what you save. For some people, that's not enough of an incentive to keep doing it. But still, Volt drivers keep doing it. They're even plugging in more if they need. And I think that in this case, the story is, it's not about saving a nickel of time, or it's about driving on electric only. People who can finish a day driving the car as an electric car are much more motivated to keep plugging in and driving it as an electric car. People who, by plugging in their car, only can save a little bit of money, but they still the car behave as a hybrid car with a little bit better MPG, are more likely to stop doing it after a while. Same way that we really want to save, a couple of dollars here and there, and we make our life easier. I think that the very simple equation here is more range, more power. You get better charging behavior and get better results. And we see it in many other studies on the topic.
I'm going to harp on Dave one more time. So I noticed in your Manheim data that there's no Teslas involved, and I'm assuming that's because Tesla just doesn't use the Manheim auction system for their resale. But if they were included in this model, do you have any idea of if that would change the BEV relationship, because they are a sizable portion of the used BEV market?
I mean, it would be entirely speculation, but I would suspect that a higher proportion of Teslas would stay in California just because they're super expensive. And, the people, as Gil has shown, the people who are buying those are very rich. And there are lots of rich people in California who, probably don't care as much about the subsidy effects that I was looking at. But that's pure speculation.
Yeah, because I know in some other states they kind of exclude Teslas from their subsidy program, so it just seems like an interesting control. I mean, I don't know how you would ever get them in the Manheim auction system, so.
Last call for questions. All right, I want to remind everyone online that the slides are available on our website, because we got a question about that. So if you go to ARB Research Seminars, there's a link to this study and then a link to the slides themselves. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to get in touch with me or the researchers. And let's thank them one more time for all their effort.